If you don't know my story, I actually grew up 38 miles from here in New Hampton, Iowa. I became an FBI agent. In my law school class at the University of Iowa, there was only one other guy and I who interviewed for the FBI in the whole class. And at the time, you know, the FBI had a bad reputation. Of course, that's all changed, you know, in the meantime. So, you know, when Mel said 9/11, you know, everything changed. It's this Orwellian world right now. And it just seems to get worse and worse and worse. As bad as these horror stories are, there's even worse than this. These things are turning into hate crimes now. This form of racism, Islamophobia, is not only turning into hate crimes where people are actually, mosques are getting burned. There was some kind of incident even in St. Cloud recently. But on top of that, the canary in the coal mine, it has gone on to everyone. What started as really a targeted effort on Muslims because of the so-called war on terrorism now has spread to everyone in different ways. And we know this, of course, now from documents in the Snowden disclosures, the whistleblower on the NSA. Before that, we knew it also, but we didn't have the documents. Even the Washington Post, this isn't a conspiracy, by the way, folks. This is mainstream. The Washington Post wrote an article, Top Secret America, in 2010. It was on their front page for 3 days in a row. Dana Priest, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, thought she was going to win another one. But nobody read the articles. And this was one of their most long, it was turned into a front line. Has anybody seen Top Secret America? Okay, so that actually is easier to understand than reading all of the disclosures about Snowden. The difference is Snowden had the documents to prove it, and she just had sources. So, the first thing you have to understand is I was a whistleblower about 9/11 itself. And the reason I was is because after 9/11, what did they say? Oh, no one would have known people would fly a plane into a building. Condi Rice said that. Condi Rice had been in on the planning of a prior conference months before 9/11 where the scenario was to fly a plane into a conference where Bush was. And so these things were not true at all. And they stopped an investigation of 9/11 for months and months. Cheney even wrote to Daschle and said, we can't have an investigation. The 3,000 family members, the 3,000 victims, their family members were demanding some accountability because little by little things were leaking out. But the bottom line with this is it took 3 years to get the 9/11 Commission report to even come out. And the main, I would say there's 41 recommendations and different findings, but the main finding, the main thrust is Chapter 8, and that report says the system was blinking red. And this means that there was so much information, so many warnings and clues, and people from different parts of the world that were coming in. There's a memo in April of 2001, 5 months before 9/11, that says Bin Laden and the Chechen leader Abu Khattab were entwined and were going to attack. Okay, so you never heard this after 9/11. And so there was this reluctance to tell that they should have done something. The 9/11 Commission report says essentially that it was a failure to share information inside of agencies. So the case up in Minnesota was a case where the agency stovepiped. The term stovepiping means that the information was blocked at a certain key level. That's inside the agency of the FBI, and that's the case I knew about and wrote about afterwards. The other thing, though, was that the agencies were not sharing information with each other. The CIA had been following 2 of the terrorist pilots for like 2 years and knew that they had come into California. How many people knew this? That the CIA, and at the time, the watch list now, the no-fly list might be somewhat smaller, but the watch list is 1 million people. There are 1 million. So you talk about your friends' names on it. The Northfield police chief was on it. There is, and that's already a few years ago. I think Kennedy was on it before he died. So, I mean, there are 1 million people on this watch list now. At the time of 9/11, there were only 16. So if you were 2 of the 16, and they had been following you and actually listening to your conversations, okay, why did not the CIA tell the FBI? There's to this day no one knows. That has never been, they've not allowed the CIA to even testify as to why they did not tell the FBI. Okay, and then the worst thing of all of this of 9/11 was the failure to share information from the government with the public. I was talking to a gentleman before we started, and I said, you remember the Millennium Threat? People remember the Millennium Threat. They told us the computers would all, whatever, and we were actually, they did put out a lot of warnings about what might happen with terrorism, etc. at the Millennium. But in the summer of 2001, the directors knew. In fact, they're described as saying their hair was on fire. Okay, so they all knew what was happening, the warnings. The public had no idea. And if the public had known, if there had been some information sharing with the public, it conceivably would have not happened. In fact, the 9/11 Commission report says even if the arrest of Moussaoui had been made public, it probably would have been canceled. That's just one piece of information. If you know the story of the flight that was brought down in Pennsylvania because the passengers attacked the terrorists, they had a few minutes of warning. They were the only flight that knew what had happened before them. That critical piece of information made all the difference and probably saved the White House or the Capitol. So information sharing is absolutely key, and it's the mistake that it's the problem of 9/11. What did the government do after 9/11? Well, there was still secrecy about this. Well, no one knew any of these things. They of course, made plans to begin torture really soon. They started, within a month or two, started saying, Cheney said, we're going to have to take the gloves off. We're going to have to start torturing. They made the legalization memos to kidnap and detain people, put them on Guantanamo. 74 people on Guantanamo to this day are just like some of these cases, completely innocent. They've been cleared by the Bush administration. They can't get off. They did that. They began to tell the people to look for information to connect Iraq. You know, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Zero. It had no connection whatsoever. And in fact, the leader of Iraq was an enemy of Al-Qaeda. If Saddam Hussein had not been attacked and taken out, we would not have Islamic State terrorism to this day. It would not exist because Saddam was an enemy of the Al-Qaeda fundamentalists. But, okay, we did all of these wrong things. One of the wrong things was something that a felon, Poindexter, announced very soon after 9/11 was we're going to have something called total information awareness. Sounds good, great, huh? But it ends up to be a thought crime is what it amounts to. You're going to have everyone spying. They even talked about having your utility persons, your meter readers, your post people, giving information to the FBI, whatever. Everybody would be opened up as an informant. They would start getting all of these, what we call third-party records that you generate. Your health, I mean, healthcare is probably the most one, that privacy one, but it's your telephone records, your internet usage, your hotel records, your travel records. I mean, every record that you have, somebody else knows about it. Well, the government says, what, if we collect it all, that was the thing, if we collect it all, somehow we'll be able to prevent terrorism. And so this idea took root, and when he announced it, and by the way, within a week after 9/11, Bush told the then NSA director, Michael Hayden, that they were going to violate the law and flip the switch. And so instead of just spying on foreign countries, of course that's always been the case, NSA, CIA, whatever, they can always do illegal things and spy on foreigners. That's always been the case. The FBI couldn't, or wasn't supposed to, but the CIA and the FBI and the NSA could. After 9/11, they flipped the switches and made this including on American citizens. And then a year or two later is when Poindexter announced this. Now, when he announced that we were going to do this, people weren't ready for Orwell. We had to be desensitized little by little to these things, to where we're going through the electronic machine nude, where, you know, essentially that takes a picture of you without your clothes on when you're going through the airport scanner, and everybody does it. Nobody opts out, everybody walks right through. But it took a long time for people to get used to this, and so people threw a fit. And you look at the icon that goes with total information. He was public about this. This is right out of Orwell. It's the big seeing eye. He even said, you know, he thought people would be so afraid after 9/11 that people would say this is great. Well, Congress defunded total information awareness. But guess what? It did not end anything by defunding it. It just went underground. By the way, they were already doing these things. They were already doing the massive data collection. So, this isn't the first time these abuses of law and the spying and the secrecy, etc., have occurred. They've occurred essentially every time the United States is at war. If you go back to the Civil War, for example, Abraham Lincoln even declared martial law. And so, I don't want to scare people, but I guess I will. The precedents that were set in the worst era of our history, the Civil War, and people would say maybe Abraham Lincoln had to do these things, but he shut down freedom of speech. He actually had editors of newspapers who were critical of the Union Army were raided, and we talk about Muslims being raided, whatever. Editors of newspapers during the Civil War were raided and put in prison if they criticized the Union because of the martial law. But the precedents is called law of war are now cited in Guantanamo briefs as the common law of war. You probably didn't know this. A friend of mine is a JAG attorney, a defense attorney for this, and this is incredible that they're citing the worst precedents possible from the Civil War. Fast forward to World War I. In World War I, many of you know that this was actually when Hoover got his start, J. Edgar Hoover, and they had people like Debs, what's his name, first name? Eugene Debs went to jail for 7 years because he was against World War I. You had the Espionage Act of 1917. Now, we're all against espionage, real espionage. Espionage is, for instance, the two CIA guys, Robert Hansen and another guy in the FBI, Robert Hansen, and then two CIA. There were 4 altogether that I know of, and there were probably more, but there were 4 that were caught. They were selling secrets during the Cold War to the Soviet Union. That's what we think of with espionage. But this Espionage Act, actually in 1917, is worded in a broad way. And it can include not only going after government whistleblowers like Snowden. Snowden's charged under the 1917 Espionage Act. Okay, so we have to go back all the way to World War I. He's already charged under that, and Obama has charged and prosecuted 7 government whistleblowers, which is twice as many as in all history. And the one that you probably recall was during, again, we're going to fast forward, another war, the Vietnam War. Ellsberg was the very first prosecution under this 1917 Espionage Act. And he narrowly was not convicted because of what Nixon, everybody found out Nixon was ordering burglaries. One of the burglaries was into his psychiatrist's office, and the judge dismissed the case for government wrongdoing. What people don't know, 19 newspapers, we were braver. Our media was a lot braver during Vietnam for a lot of reasons. 19 newspapers defied the Department of Justice at the time to publish parts of the Pentagon Papers. The Department of Justice was going to actually go after the New York Times. Okay, so this is going back to the Civil War and how you have to stop newspapers' publications. They weren't able to, but they did actually investigate the reporter back in that time period. So, going back to Vietnam, we had all of your agencies, the CIA, FBI, and NSA, were doing the same things. They did not have the high tech back then. So they couldn't just, what we call, vacuum it all up easily. Now they can just go on your telephone calls and they get metadata, they get all of your telephone calls in and out, all of your internet connections, etc. So they can do it through fiber optics. It's all flooding into a giant computer out in Utah right now that takes up more energy than all of Salt Lake City. This computer uses trillions and trillions of non-relevant, completely non-relevant information and data is being vectored up. Well, back in the Vietnam War, they didn't have that high tech. But what they did do is every agency had programs. And if you are of my age, 60 and older, you probably remember Get Smart, where he talked into his shoe phone. You remember that? Well, the bad guys in Get Smart were called Chaos. That was an actual name of the CIA's program at the time. Oh, no. To this day, that was a true name, Chaos. You can Google it. To this day, no one knows much about how Chaos was working. And the reason is they didn't really get a whistleblower. And they didn't really get to the end of it. Now, in the FBI, there was a guy who was number 3 in the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. His name was William Sullivan. And he more or less flipped. He had been part of COINTELPRO, just as Deep Throat had been part of COINTELPRO. But he came clean and told the church committee, I should say he was debriefed and told them what he knew about the whole thing going on with COINTELPRO. So that's why we know more about it. He actually, though, ended up in a strange, untimely death, Sullivan, a day before he was to testify to the church committee in a hunting accident. So no one knows much about this, but Sullivan said, well, we were sitting at these tables, you know, a few of us, all secret, by the way, all top secret, coming up with the plots, for instance, to break into Martin Luther King's hotel rooms. Martin Luther King was monitored because Hoover thought he was like an enemy communist. At the time, instead of terrorist, it was communist. And, you know, had this connection and got tapes of Martin Luther King, blackmailed Martin Luther King. The COINTELPRO actually wrote an anonymous letter threatening Martin Luther King that if he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, that they would release the tapes, etc. And basically suggested he should commit suicide. How many of you know that your government, in the form, again, we're talking 60s, I'm sorry, 60s. These were all in the late 60s. That in the 60s, a man for whom we now have a federal holiday, and considered a remarkable hero, was blackmailed by the government in order not to accept the Peace Prize. Okay, so this is how bad things can get. We have seen this before. Now, I just want to stop at the NSA's Minaret program. The NSA's Minaret program, we don't know much about either, too. It's kind of like the Chaos one. But about a year and a half ago, a document got finally, under Freedom of Information, got released. And this document said that there were 1,500 Americans. Okay, so we have a scale here. Now we have 1 million people on the watch list, but back then NSA was targeting 1,500 Americans. Now, no one knows to this day who 1,493 were. Probably most of them are deceased by now. But no one knows who the 1,493, but on this document were named 7 of the 1,500. Now, you might just guess who the 7 were. For starters, poor Martin Luther King Jr., he was targeted by everyone, so he was on the list. Muhammad Ali was on the list because he had been an objector, a conscientious objector to Vietnam. That's, I'm guessing, why. A New York Times editor. New York Times editor was on the list, a main editor. The Washington Post humorist Art Buchwald was on the list. When we say these things have to make sense, by the way, they don't. They will never make sense, and that's another reason why people should be afraid. People who got scooped up and renditioned and even tortured were not terrorists at all. They were just people who had the wrong last name, complete and utter mistakes, and this occurs all the time. I don't know. Art Buchwald must have been too funny. I don't know. There was another NAACP leader on it. Now, the two most chilling people of the 7 that we know who were on the list targeted by the NSA in the Minaret program, last 6 years of Vietnam were Frank Church himself. Senator Frank Church was on the list. And so was another senator, Howard Baker, who was for the Vietnam War. Okay? When we're talking to people about this, you're always going to get this argument that it's not nice to spy on Muslims, it's not nice to have to detain them and torture them. We wish we didn't have to do this. It breaks my heart. You'll hear the politicians actually say that it breaks their heart that they have to do these things. They have to launch the wars and the sanctions on other countries, but we have to. Because it helps our security. So they're always going to make what is actually in logic a form of utilitarian proposition. And ends justify the means. And right now, unfortunately, most people in the United States believe that all of the things that are going on, even including walking into the airport, you know, with that dumb electronic scanner, the massive spying, the torture. Torture's like 50–60% of Americans think that torture works. It makes us more secure. They do the polls. As long as you believe that, you're going to say it's perfectly ethical. I've been in many debates with people on ethics, and they will say if it works, the problem is there is no evidence that torture has ever worked, other than to get a false confession of a witch that you want to kill, or in the Inquisition, or in Stalin's, you know, whatever. So these things don't work at all, and it's actually, especially with the massive collection, it's actually making us less secure. I'm going to have to speed up because I know we want to get through this, but I developed this triangle, and I don't even know if you can read it all, a long time ago when I was trying to explain how the regular criminal justice system works. And the Fourth Amendment, I taught law to the FBI for 13 years, law and ethics. And so in the old days, before 9/11, no one would have dreamed in their wildest dreams that we would be doing these things. I can just tell you that right now. Now, if you went to the old agents in the Hoover era, they would believe it. In fact, I was warned when I first joined the FBI not to do what they did during the COINTELPRO period. But the Fourth Amendment works where when you don't know who has committed a serious crime, and we're not saying a thought crime in the future, that's the difference. In the old days, the crime had to have been committed. Okay? Not, we're going to prevent future crimes like Minority Report by being able to somehow scan all data and it will just accurately pick out the terrorists. That's the theory here, folks, and it's absolutely a complete lie. It's Minority Report, that movie. It can't possibly exist. There is no way to predict future behavior. None. And they cannot look at this information and decide, there's no computer program that can do this. So in the old days, when a crime was committed, you still didn't know who had done it. And you had very little evidence to go initially. And the only thing that you could do in the old days was you could profile. Okay, so in the drug war, and the war on drugs, and it goes back to stopping blacks, driving while black was considered a crime. I used to actually go to conferences where police chiefs would argue the ethics of stopping blacks in the war on drugs. And, you know, there would be somebody saying, this is not right, we shouldn't be stopping blacks. You know, there would be some guy saying that, and go, we have to. We have to get the drugs. We have to seize the drugs. We have to stop, you know, how bad a plague the drugs are. The only thing that made a difference was an Ohio law professor in the 90s did a study, and he found that stopping mostly blacks looking for drugs was counterproductive. They were missing more drugs by profiling than they were if they had just done it, you know, on everyone. So basically, a year after 9/11, the Bush administration made profiling illegal for the war on drugs, and actually for any crime. There's a policy that made, in the federal system, Department of Drug Enforcement Administration, etc., made profiling illegal for everything but the war on terrorism. And so the war on terrorism is still allows profiling, and that's why you get this disparate behavior. Okay, so as you go up and you get more evidence to suggest somebody actually committed a crime, the next level up is reasonable suspicion. And in the old days, if you had reasonable suspicion, you could detain someone temporarily. You couldn't put them on Guantanamo for 10 years, but you could detain them. A bank robber, you quickly go get the teller, and you bring them to the scene. They say, is this the guy that robbed the bank? And he could be detained for an hour or two, maybe at the most. And you had to have reasonable suspicion. The next level up was something that people have heard, probable cause. Well, probable cause is considered more likely than not. And when you have probable cause, you could monitor someone. You could listen into their telephone calls. In New York City, I worked on the mafia, the Italian organized crime. And those John Gotti people types, if you ever saw the movie Goodfellas or Wise Guys, I listened to those terrible conversations for 2 years and transcribed the conversations for court. And no civil liberties group had any problem with that. And the reason was, every single one of those targets, there was something between 60 to 100, sometimes 200 pages of written evidence describing why probable cause existed. So there were very few mistakes. The I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. Okay, then you go up to indictment, where you have to, it's again probable cause, arrest, surveillance. Then the next one is conviction. Standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's very high level. You have to have a whole 12 people, a jury, has to find that there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And then even if you're convicted, you get to go to appeal, and you get to say that the judge made a mistake by admitting this evidence, the attorney made a mistake, etc. And if you exhaust all of that, it takes usually years of due process in order to get that point. Then finally, you are at the end called, what I call, throw away the key, which actually some of the people you know are already in now. This was a triangle. Okay, so what you can do after 9/11 is you can just tip it upside down completely, throw away the key, or all the innocent people, scooped up, and in some cases put on Guantanamo, in other cases taken to black sites and tortured. In other cases, the NSA surveillance, which actually could find any number of connections, because they go 3 hops out. So it's not only all of your friends, it's all of your friends' friends, and your friends' friends' friends. If you're on Facebook and have a couple thousand Facebook friends, you have 1 million+ people in your 3 hops out. Well, when they try to make these connections like this, it's far worse than the Red Scare and the COINTELPRO era. They end up then targeting people, and they use entrapment to try to get them to commit a crime. So many of these cases now are where they targeted them based on the fact that they surfaced, and then they tried to get them to do something. And I can tell you too, it's very easy to get people to commit crimes. If you are using the proper pressures on them and pushing their buttons, it's not hard at all to get any normal person to commit a crime. It's easy. This is a joke that appeared after the Top Secret America. It's like one overweight bureaucrat to another one, and they're looking at the fancy chart. There's about 800 public agencies now that have these top secret clearances that you don't know much about unless you read the Washington Post. There's about 800. There's 16 main ones, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, but there's many more. Some of them are small, and there's 1,200 private contractors. These millions and billions and trillions, at least $1 trillion has been spent since 9/11 of taxpayer money. We're going bankrupt. We're up to $18 trillion now of national debt, and yet they're wasting the money on all of this stuff. So one guy says, who usually catches the terrorists? And the other guy says, usually it's an alert t-shirt vendor who's not on the chart. And that was the true story in the Times Square bombing. It was the vendors on the street that noticed smoke coming out of the back of the car. It was the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, it was the fellow passengers who stopped it. The 2,000 agencies did not stop this. The Boston Marathon bombing. Even Islamic State, they didn't even have the information about that. So if this was working to make us more secure, why would the public be the ones to do that? So this, this is a quote. Lord Acton is famous, power corrupts, and he also had a quote about secrecy. Everything secret degenerates, even the administration of justice. Nothing is safe that does not show how it can bear discussion and publicity. We were to have another speaker tonight about the anti-war activists who were targeted by an undercover agent and a kind of a provocateur up in the Twin Cities. And she couldn't make it. But this is a fair depiction. And, again, this is the canary in the coal mine. The spying is going massive. It's spying on anti-fracking groups in Pennsylvania, Catholic worker. There have been findings, you don't have to believe me, this is the Inspector Generals that have found this already. There was supposed to be a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. That was a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. They stalled that for 10 years. The law passed in 2004 that was to have this Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. It actually did not get off the ground until recently on the NSA. And this is a young man, Aaron Schwartz, who, they consider people that, secrets now are considered insider threats. So Edward Snowden, probably many people are considered insider threats. And they have programs in all government agencies. They have to have a place where they report you. If you don't like your coworker, you can just go and report them as an insider threat. He was caught downloading some academic articles that were not, they were, I don't know if they were copyrighted, but they were not to be downloaded and shared. He shared some academic articles in Boston. He's actually was a very brilliant student who founded Reddit. And he knew the Harvard professors, the good government Harvard. Anyways, he committed suicide because they were threatening to do the same thing to him. Put him in jail. The U.S. attorney threatened to put him in jail for a long period of time. This cartoon was the NSA cartoon in 2011, long before Edward Snowden's disclosures. So this cartoonist, Ted Rall, was very with it. He knew what was going on. So it's funny because it shows the NSA looking into somebody's bedroom, and they have them all profiled over to the side, and etc. But these satire cartoons, you can't hardly make satire anymore because it's all true. Essentially, it's very difficult. Okay, so here are the recommendations. When people say, what do you do? Oh, Colleen, you're such a critic. You're such a critic. What would you do? So I put some recommendations. The bottom line is it's very easy. You don't do what they did after 9/11. Everything they have done has created the problem we are in, and actually getting worse. Islamic State is pretty serious right now. And it's so good at recruiting because of the situation that in the Twin Cities, 13, they think at least 13 people have gone over to fight, including one woman. Now, if they come back, let's say they make it out alive, which is another thing, but there's hundreds from the UK, so that people from all over Europe now are fighting with really probably the worst form of these terrorists, so bad that Al-Qaeda expelled them. I mean, why has this occurred? Did it just occur because of Islamic faith? Did it occur because of that? I mean, that's the propaganda. Absolutely not. It has occurred because of our policies. We've had CIA people trying to tell us this from the time of 9/11. When Bush says they hate our freedoms, we've got to go out and have wars on them, they hate our freedoms. And the CIA, a very hard-edged guy, would say, that is nonsense. They don't hate our freedoms. They hate our policies in the Mideast. And so, as bad as it was now, it is many, many times worse. So, and the wars, for starters. The wars have caused this problem. You cannot kill your way out of this. Our military says we have to win hearts and minds. You cannot win hearts and minds through drone bombing and starting wars. It's absolutely not. But we're falling for it for a variety of rationales. And it's exceptionalism at its root. I'm going to suggest a great article written by Bromwich called Why Exceptionalism is Important. Google Bromwich and exceptionalism, why exceptionalism. People have now believed that we can bring human rights and democracy and freedom and love and peace, actually bring peace through bombing the village to save it. It's amazing, but that's what people believe. Okay, you've got to focus on the bad guys, not the innocent. When you are inputting any kind of database full of trash, it's like adding hay to the haystack. If you're looking for a needle, you cannot add hay and think it's going to be easier to find the needle. Irrelevant info is going to make it much, much harder. By the way, the government's argument back, when they started having hearings, they haven't reformed the NSA yet. There's been no even real, there's 10 bills, but they're stalled. So, but when they began to have hearings, they called in the FBI, not Homeland Security, the intelligence czar, Clapper, who had lied, said they weren't, collecting information on Americans, Clapper and Alexander, the CIA, and they said, well, is this working? And they said, yes, we have 54 examples. And they tried to claim that they had proven that 54 examples where the massive collection worked. The reporters looked at them, they debunked every one of them, except a real flimsy one case of a taxi driver who gave $8,000 to somebody in Somalia. And that was the only case they had. So there is no evidence that any of this is working, making it harder. Reduce government secrecy to the necessary minimum. Both Bush and Obama, the secrecy, the number of classified documents now is on a chart like this. There were about 6 million in 96. There were 92 million. It went from 6 million to 92 million in a few years. Increase independent oversight of and whistleblower protection. We're doing just the opposite. They're going after every whistleblower, telling them they're going to get life in prison, and even threatening execution of whistleblowers right now, starting Homeland Security. There is no way that you can even make, I don't think, I've been retired, by the way, since 2004, but my guess is that even if you were one of the people who wanted to do the job right, and you had a suggestion, even if you made a very good suggestion, they're going to put you down as somebody who's disgruntled and possibly, oh, you could look at that person, they could be an insider threat. Okay, so there's no oversight and there's no whistleblower protection. Reduce government corruption and revolving door conflicts of interest that Eisenhower was the first to warn about. There is a complete revolving door of the highest level people who, when they retire, generals. Keith Alexander was the NSA director during this time period, and it's rumored, I think it's reported, that he went from retiring from the NSA just a few months ago to making $18 million a month, not a year, a month. So many of the revolving door high-level officials, they go into these spy agencies like some of the 2000 back and forth because of their clearances. Some of them work for foreign countries, and they're actually working for the people that we claim are our enemy countries, that they tell us. The same people. And the last one is repeal these two provisions. You don't have to repeal the entire Espionage Act, but the worst parts of it that have no public good defense. So one of the reasons Edward Snowden says he can't come back here and face trial, he doesn't say this, it's the truth. He can't come back here because he would not even be allowed to make his own public defense that he was giving this information out, not to help Al-Qaeda, not to help Russia or China. He can't even say, I was trying to tell Americans that they should know that their own government is spying on them, and maybe they would want to have a reform of this law. He would not even be allowed to have what they call a public good defense under this old law. And then the worst part of this is that it's not just individuals, that you lose your privacy, of course, and your Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure, and your right against your right against incriminating yourself. That's the Fifth Amendment. That's through both torture, where you have your false confessions, but it's also through this listening. They're listening in on people. So those things, it's not just those things. The worst thing, as bad as those are, as bad as the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, which are basically, right now, are almost gone. And it's being applied to Americans through the National Defense Authorization Act. The worst is the First Amendment. The First Amendment, your right to freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and what's another one?
Freedom of press.
And press. Oh my gosh, and press. Are right now really, really threatened. The New York Times reporter, James Risen, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, who actually wrote one of the stories about this, is being threatened to go to prison because he will not give up the source of one of his points in his articles. Other reporters have been spied on. Other reporters have been threatened. Other reporters are called collaborators. And we also have an editor in Germany who's written a top-seller book. You probably haven't heard of it in the United States because they do not talk about this. But a few weeks ago, a German editor of a major newspaper in Germany wrote a book that the CIA owned him. They went to him, everything that he wrote, he had to run by the CIA. He's an editor. There's a story about a Los Angeles Times reporter the same way. So if you want to stay in the good graces of this very powerful war machine, etc., you actually will send your drafts to people so that they approve of what you're writing. And so, and actually, it could even be worse than this. So, folks, we are indeed the canary. And if we don't, as the Professor Schrödinger is doing by speaking out, we need to be really following these issues, because we are the ones, and our children and our grandchildren are going to be the ones on the line. We need to go back to, all you have to do is tell